Hello, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center AASHTO Bike Guide Series webinar. Today's webinar is titled Overview of Revised AASHTO Guide for Development of Bicycle Facilities, and we will be speaking with Jennifer Toole, Principal of Toole Design Group, and Peter Lagerwey, a Senior Planner with Toole Design Group. My name is James Gallagher, and I am the PBIC Communications Manager. I will be facilitating today's webinar. I'd first like to say hello to today's speakers to make sure that they are ready and everyone can hear them. Jennifer, are you there?
I'm here.
And Peter, do we have you on the line as well?
I'm here.
Great. Attendees, if you can hear me and if you can hear our speakers, please click the hand icon in the box in the upper right corner of your screen so we can be sure you can hear us. All right, I'm seeing a bunch of people hitting their hands, so I believe you can all hear us. Before we get started with today's webinar, I want to go over a few administrative details and the functionality of the webinar software. If for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, please reload the website and log back into the program. You'll be able to rejoin the session. And please note that attendees will not be able to speak during this webinar. We do expect a large number of attendees on this call, so by muting your audio, it helps us to cut down on confusion and background noise. As an attendee, you have a control box in the upper right corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the double arrows. So you're not able to speak, you are able to ask questions by typing them into that box. If you have a problem during the webinar, you may enter it here. I'll monitor these questions and try to respond to you if I am able. Questions pertaining to the presentation may be asked at any time, but will not be addressed until the end of the program, when we have built in about 20 minutes for a discussion period. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along, and we will try to get to them after the presentation. Also, when you exit the webinar, there is a brief survey that will pop up. We would very much appreciate your feedback on our performance. Following today's webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email. This email will be sent 1 to 2 days after the presentation, and will include a link to download a printable certificate of attendance for 1.5 hours of instruction. If there are multiple attendees at your site, please forward this link to the other participants so they can download and print the certificate with their name. This webinar has been submitted to AICP and has been approved for 1.5 CM credits. The Road Safety Academy, the training and education arm of the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, is a registered provider of CM credits. For more information on the Road Safety Academy, please visit www.rsa.unc.edu. Also, AASHTO has kindly agreed to provide a 20% discount to attendees of this webinar series. Details for how to get that discount will be provided in the follow-up email. This is the first 7 webinars on the AASHTO Bike Guide. For more information on those and other future webinars, or to view the archives from this webinar series and others, please visit www.walkinginfo.org/webinars. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking and bicycling. These courses can be found at www.walkinginfo.org/training. Before I turn the screen over to Jennifer and Peter for the presentation, I want to take a quick poll from the audience. If you could please quickly answer those questions, I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, I have one other poll question. Great, thank you very much. All right, now I'd like to start the presentation. I'd like to welcome and thank Jennifer and Peter for their presentation today. We will take questions at the end. Jennifer, please take it from here.
Okie doke. Thank you very much, James. Okay, my name is Jennifer Toole, and I'm the president of Toole Design Group. And I'm happy to talk to all of you today about the AASHTO Bike Guide. It's a nice way to finish out your week. And I'm also glad to hear that this is such a popular topic. James told us before we began that over 1,100 people signed up to watch this webinar. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to give you some background on the 2012 AASHTO Bike Guide. We're going to focus on major content changes in this version of the Bike Guide, focusing on bigger picture issues, changes in direction, and those sorts of things. And Peter Lagerwey in our Seattle, Washington office is then going to talk about the chapter-by-chapter content changes. This is the first in a series of 7 webinars that we're going to be doing about the Bike Guide. And so as I said, this first one will be an overview. Later in August 22nd, we'll be doing a webinar on the planning chapter of the guide. And then in September, we're going to start a 2-webinar series on on-road bikeways in the guide. There's quite a lot of content in that section of the guide. We've broken it up into 2 different webinars. The first will focus on bike lane design. And then the second one will focus on all the other things that are in the on-road bikeway chapter. And then in October, we'll talk about shared use paths, starting with on October 9th with geometric design, then following up October 23rd with intersection design. And then our last webinar will be in November. We'll cover bikeway maintenance and operation during that webinar. In addition to the webinars, we have plans to do some in-person trainings, day-long trainings that are being organized by the League of American Bicyclists. So if you're interested in one of those trainings, you should contact the League of American Bicyclists to arrange to have those a training brought to your community. And as James mentioned, AASHTO has offered a 20% discount to all webinar participants on the cost of the guide. If you don't have a copy yet, then this is definitely the best way to get one. And more information about that is on PBIC's website. This is the location of that flyer that gives you instructions on how to get that discount. And I'll have this up again at the end of the webinar. Okay, so starting with some background information about how the guide was developed. The guide was developed by AASHTO, which is the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. And their mission is to provide support to states. And one way they do that is through design guidance. AASHTO publishes over 100 different guides on lots and lots of different topics, and one of those topics is bicycle facility planning and design. So this is the 4th edition of the guide, and design practitioners have really been chomping at the bit to get this guide. The last guide was published back in 1999 and was really largely written in the years before that. And so design guidance that we've had has been from AASHTO has been well over a decade old. And that's in a field that is really rapidly changing. Bikeway design is changing quickly, and so it's definitely time to have some new guidance. And I do want to point out that it is a guideline. It's not a standard. And that's, I think, a very important thing to understand. The Bike Guide does not use words like shall or must. It uses words like should or may. And so it's, there's a lot of flexibility in the design guidance that it provides. Some background on how the guide was developed. It was developed through the NCHRP process. An NCHRP, National Cooperative Highway Research Program, is a wing of the National Academy of Sciences, which was created by President Lincoln to provide independent advice to government on matters related to science and technology. And so it's important to understand the origins and level of rigor that goes into preparing this kind of design guidance. NCHRP is the state DOT's research program, and the state DOTs fund it. So they participate on many of the panels that oversee these projects, in addition to private sector folks, researchers, academics, advocates, etc. And so this guide began with a pre-study. It was a national survey and a comprehensive literature review. It was done by Sprinkle Consulting. And then we launched the preparation of the content of the 4th edition. And that was overseen by a panel of experts I'll show you in just a moment. And the contractor for that was my firm, Tool Design Group. And then the final edits and the state DOT balloting process was handled by the Midwest Research Institute, and Darren Torbeck was the lead for that project. Okay, so this just shows you all the different people who were involved in developing this guide, both on the consulting team side as well as the panelists that were involved. And I think the point to take away from this is that folks from all over the United States were involved in all different kinds of backgrounds. Many of us at Tool Design Group were involved in writing the content of the guide, and you'll hear from different folks at Tool Design Group throughout this webinar series. A few words about how the bike guide is used. State DOTs, of course, use the guide, often either adopt the guide as their standard or use it as the basis for their own state guidelines, like this Wisconsin Bike Facility Design Handbook. Local jurisdictions use the guide as well. Sometimes they use AASHTO's version or the state's version, and sometimes they use some combination of the two to develop their own version of their own bike guidance. The guide was released in June of 2012, just 2 months ago, and just to give you a sense for how expanded this guide is, it went from 75 pages to over 200 pages, quite a bit more information, and that's the reason why we're doing multiple webinars to cover all of that. Went from 3 chapters to 7 chapters, and sold 1,200 copies in its first month. Okay, so obviously the bike guide is one manual, and it's certainly supplements a number of other different guidelines that are out there. And just to give you a sense of how it relates to those, it also so that 2009 Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is published by Federal Highway Administration, this manual covers signs, signals, and pavement markings, and the information that's in the 2009 METCD and in subsequent guidance that Federal Highways has issued on bikeways is incorporated into the 2012 AASHTO Bike Guide. So the two documents are compatible with each other. In a number of cases, the AASHTO Bike Guide elaborates on design treatments that are in the METCD and gives more information on how to use those different design treatments. And so that's important to understand. The 2011 AASHTO Green Book doesn't have a whole lot of content about bike facility design, but it does refer to the AASHTO Bike Guide. And so this is the Bike Guide is the manual that you go to for more information than what you can find in the AASHTO Green Book. The AASHTO Bike Guide also refers to documents that are produced by the United States Access Board. The Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines are incorporated into the AASHTO Bike Guide, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes about how those have been incorporated into the guide. And then it also refers to the 2010 Highway Capacity Manual. There's quite a bit more in that version of the HCM on bicycle level service and using tools to just determine the right treatment for bicyclists. And so that's incorporated into the AASHTO Bike Guide as well. Okay, so one question I often get asked is what's the difference between the AASHTO Bike Guide and the NACTO Bike Guide? And NACTO is the National Association of City Transportation Officials, and that organization has also published a bike guide, a very good bike guide. And so I think it's important to understand the differences between these two guides and how to use them together to design good bikeways. And so it's important to understand the AASHTO Bike Guide is a comprehensive manual. It covers all aspects of bike facility planning and design for both on-road and off-road bikeways, including fundamental operating characteristics of bicyclists and how those impact geometric design. The NACTO guide is really not intended to be a comprehensive guide in that way. And just to give you an example, the AASHTO guide explains in detail how to calculate stopping sight distance for bicyclists. And the NACTO guide does not cover that. And that's really a fundamental operating characteristic that any roadway designer needs to know in order to design any kind of bikeway. So another difference is that rather than covering all types of bikeways, the NACTO guide covers certain types of on-road bike facility designs, specifically bike lanes and several new and innovative types of on-street bikeway design treatments. The NACTO guide does not cover shared use paths or go into a great deal of detail on signal design or many other relevant topics. So I think it's important to understand that it's not really an either-or situation. Cities that are interested in building innovative bikeway designs correctly should use both of the guides. And I should also mention that NACTO is getting ready to issue a new edition of their guide, I believe in September. So look for that as well. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the major changes in the 2012 AASHTO Bike Guide. And we're going to cover 5 general topics in this part of the presentation. And we'll go through each of these. Okay, choosing bikeway types. So the 1999 edition of the AASHTO Bike Guide was pretty silent on the type of bikeway that's appropriate given certain roadway characteristics. It laid out the various bikeway types but really gave no guidance on how to choose the right type and didn't really speak to what bicyclist preferences were either. The 2012 AASHTO Bike Guide has greatly changed this. There's a lot of guidance on facility selection. In fact, there's a lot of guidance on this in both the planning chapter, which we'll talk about in our next webinar, as well as the design chapters. And there's a great deal of support for bike lanes and shared use paths where volumes and speeds are higher. In fact, the guide makes the following statement. The urban centers in the U.S. that have seen the highest levels of bicycle use are those that have built a network of bike lanes and shared use paths as the backbone of their system. So the guide really acknowledges the preferences of bicyclists and their need to feel safe when they're riding bikes. Another thing that is covered by the guide is there are multiple warnings in the 2012 guide against using wide curb lanes as a standard solution for major roadways. because we know that bicyclists don't always feel safe in those types of facilities. And a wide curb lane is a 14-foot wide lane as opposed to a 10 or 11 or 12-foot wide lane. And so it also discusses the appropriate use of shared lanes, and that lower speed and lower volume environments are better places to use those sort of shared lanes that don't have any special type of bikeway, don't have a bike lane or anything like that. Along the same lines of how to choose the appropriate bikeway type, the 2012 guide refers to bicycle level service as a tool. As I mentioned, the Highway Capacity Manual has a lot more information on how to calculate bicycle level service and a bicyclist's feeling of comfort given different roadway characteristics, different volumes of traffic, different speeds, different widths of roads. Also provides lists of roadway characteristics to consider when making those decisions. And then finally, something I think is very important is the bike guide states that bike routes are not a bikeway type. So, you know, you can't just put a sign up on any street and call it a bikeway. Accommodating bikes very often requires more than just a sign. And so you should really think of signs as a wayfinding device and not a bikeway type. So another significant change in this version of the guide is it talks quite a bit about how to retrofit roads to accommodate bicyclists. And it has a robust discussion of how to use lane diets and road diets to accomplish bikeways. And this is really just an acknowledgement that most of the bike lanes in the U.S. are created this way. So as I said, there's a section on retrofitting roads to accommodate bikes, and also a statement that says that 10-foot wide and 11-foot wide travel lanes are an acceptable way to provide bike lanes. Of course, with the appropriate attention to traffic characteristics when you make those decisions on lane widths. So, so that is a very significant change in this version of the guide. It goes along with some new language that's in the AASHTO Green Book on lane width, and another important change in the guide. The section in the guide on bike lane design is greatly expanded from previous versions of the guide. And this just talks a little bit about some of the types of changes that are in the bike lane section. We'll go into much more detail on these things in the webinar on bike lane design. But just as an overview, this section gives a lot more nuanced guidance on the appropriate widths of bike lanes. And 5 feet is still the standard width for a bike lane, but it does acknowledge situations where a 4-foot wide lane may be appropriate, all the way up to a 7-foot wide bike lane. This section of the guide talks a great deal about measures to reduce crashes with car doors and strategies to with bike lane design to avoid those types of crashes. It talks about bike lanes adjacent to back and angle parking, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it also covers bike lanes at roundabouts and how to configure bike lanes at roundabouts. This section of the guide also provides information on buffered bike lanes, like the one that you see in this photograph. You can provide that buffer either between the bike lane and an adjacent parking lane, which can be very important if you have a high turnover of cars in that parking lane, so drivers coming in and out of car doors frequently. So that's one way to use a buffer. Or you could use the buffer between the bike lane and the adjacent travel lane. That can be especially helpful if you have higher speed traffic and want a little bit of extra space for the feeling of comfort for the bicyclist The bike lane has this statement in it about green bike lanes. It allows green bike lanes, and says that green colored pavement can be used either continuously in a marked bike lane or as an intersection or conflict area device. Really gives you a lot of latitude in how to use that green color in a bike lane. And this is based on the interim approval issued by FHWA. This was a late addition to the bike guide. We're really happy about that. As I said, it also covers bike lanes adjacent to angled parking. It still recommends not using bike lanes where you have front-end angled parking, because the driver backing out of that space cannot see a bicyclist as they back into the bike lane. But with back-end angled parking, a driver can see the bicyclist much more easily, and so it provides design guidance for how to design that type of facility. So another area that the guide has changed quite a bit is the chapter on shared use path design. It's now its own chapter, and just a tremendous amount of new information on designing intersections and crossings, designing paths adjacent to roads. One important difference about this guide compared to the previous guide gave a lot of information on how to design bollards or posts at the entrances of trails to keep motor vehicle traffic off of trails, but didn't really adequately explain what a hazard those can be to bicyclists. The new bike guide strongly discourages using bollards at all unless you absolutely have a documented problem of drivers getting onto trails. Another big difference in the shared use path chapter is that there's no single design speed cited for pathway design. It acknowledges that there are variables you should consider in selecting a design speed, the types of users and the context of the pathway, the terrain, how steep the path is, and then the path surface as well. And then finally, the guide cites guidance from the U.S. Access Board that was issued last year on accessibility of shared use paths for transportation purposes. And this is a significant change. A lot of agencies were applying standards for building sites, accessibility of building sites to pathways, and that will no longer be necessary. The new guidance that's being issued by the Access Board acknowledges the inherent differences in paths that extend through natural areas and undeveloped areas. And so the guide is coordinated. The AASHTO Bike Guide is coordinated with that new guidance that's coming out from the Access Board. So paths adjacent to roadways, this is another area of change for the 2012 AASHTO Guide. And just to give you a little background, state and local departments of transportation have been building paths adjacent to roads for many years. And many of these miles are in suburban areas where intersections and driveways are ubiquitous. And so the previous version of the AASHTO Bike Guide discussed the issues and operational problems created by paths adjacent to roads where you have a lot of driveways and intersections. The new guide expands that discussion of the operational issues, but it also acknowledges that there are reasons for building paths adjacent to roads, and that they are an acceptable solution if you address those conflicts at intersections and driveways. And then it provides some guidance on where and when those facilities are appropriate. I think this is an important difference from the previous guide, because the previous guide really was universally negative about putting paths adjacent to roads. The new guide allows it, and this is important. There's a lot of communities that are very interested in designing cycle tracks, which are a type of pathway adjacent to a road, sometimes at surface level of the street, sometimes at the curb level of the street. And so there's support in this guide for how to design those facilities, and also things that acknowledge the inherent issues at intersections and driveways. There's one statement in the guide that I think is, I just wanted to point out. There's in the section of the guide that talks about how to mitigate conflicts at intersections with side paths. The following statement is made. In some situations, it may be better to place one-way side paths on both sides of the street or highway, directing wheeled users to travel in the same direction as adjacent motor vehicle traffic. This can reduce some of the concerns associated with two-way side paths at driveways and intersections. Okay, another area that the guide has that's been significantly expanded is the section on signal design. There's a very strong statement, much stronger statement than the previous guide about accommodating bikes at signals and the need to understand their characteristics and design signals accordingly. There's new guidance on minimum green, extension time when bicyclists are present. And then new formulas throughout this section that traffic engineers and signal engineers will need to understand. And we will go into more information on this section of the guide in the webinar. I believe it's the 4th webinar that we're doing. Something else I should point out is this section of the guide allows bicycle-specific signals, which is not a signal with a bicycle symbol in it. It's a signal that has a sign beneath it that says bicycle signal. And I'll explain that part of it in just a moment. The guide has a whole section on bicycle boulevards. It explains what they are and how they can be used to benefit bicyclists. Bike boulevards are routes that are often along quieter streets that provide a place for bikes to ride where traffic speeds are lower, often diverting motor vehicle traffic to other streets so that the route has fewer numbers of cars. Provides design treatments for creating bicycle boulevards. There's really no one single formula for creating a bike boulevard. It's lots of different things that can be done to make those routes better for bicycling. So that's covered in the guide. And then finally, there's quite a bit of information on integrating bikes with transit in this version of the AASHTO Bike Guide, covering all aspects of access to transit vehicles, parking at transit stations, connecting transit facilities with bikeways, and then promoting bikes on transit as well. Now, I mentioned there's a few things that are not addressed by this guide. We talked about the bike signal heads are not in this guide. Bike boxes are not in this guide either, or raised bike lanes. In the case of bike boxes and bike signal heads, the reason for that is because at the time that the guide was published, Federal Highway Administration had not yet issued any guidance on bike boxes or bike signal heads. And because they're both traffic control devices, AASHTO does not get out in front of Federal Highway Administration on endorsing something before it's in the MUTCD. So the NACTO guide is a very good place to go for information on these and other types of innovative bikeway design. Okay, with that, this covers the major content changes in the guide, and I'm going to turn this over to Peter Lagerwey, who's going to talk about the chapter-by-chapter changes. Okay, so Pete, it's getting ready to come over to you. If I can make it happen. Okay, here it comes. Peter, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Okay, can everyone see my screen? Good. Okay, great. And thank you, Jennifer. And again, my name is Pete Lagerwey. I'm also with Tool Design Group. This first image just shows the table of contents. And what I'm going to do is just show you 1 to 3 slides introducing to you what's in each one of these chapters. Also, just to note, the webinars, the future webinars that Jennifer covered earlier, won't quite exactly follow the outline you see in front of you here. If you go to number 2, we're going to have one on bicycle planning. And then if you go on chapter 4, there's going to be 2 webinars on the design of on-road facilities. And then if you go to chapter 5, there's going to be 2 webinars on the design of shared use paths. And then jumping to number 7, the one on maintenance and operation. So you can sort of coordinate looking at the future webinars along with the chapters here. Okay. Whoops. Okay, I got that working. It didn't work for a moment there. Sorry about that. Okay, chapter 1 is the introduction, and it's very similar to the introduction in the previous guide, and it retains a very strong statement, which I think is worth looking at again and reading, because it really sets the tone for the entire guide, and that's that all roads, streets, and highways, except where bicyclists are legally prohibited, should be designed and constructed under the assumption they will be used by bicyclists. So again, a very strong statement. It was in the previous guide, and it's retained in this guide. Okay, moving on then to chapter 2, bicycle planning. I'm going to have a couple of slides here related to what's in this chapter. 2 points, and Jennifer alluded to this earlier, but 2 things that I think are really important in this chapter. One is it gives really good guidance on deciding where improvements are needed. So this is things like directness, density of bike facilities, land use, feasibility, safety, all the things that you need to look at when deciding where improvements are needed. And secondly, also very important in the planning chapter, is choosing an appropriate facility type. So it's one thing to figure out where you need a bike facility, but then figuring out that next step of what's the appropriate facility. So it looks at things like speed, volume, who are the intended users, topography, cost, really a practical approach to figuring out what's the appropriate facility. So new guidance there, and I think it's going to be extremely helpful. And it really provides then the backdrop, what you need to do before you go into subsequent chapters and look at the design. Also, there's a lot of new guidance in terms of technical, again, this is in chapter 2, some technical tools that are available, data collection, for example, talks about bike counts, why they're important, how you use them. Jennifer alluded to this earlier. There's new information on the quality of service, refers you to the highway capacity level of service, talks about, again, how you use this, when you use it, why you'd want to use it. Safety analysis talks about why you would want to do a safety analysis, looking at it in terms of spot locations, corridors, crash typologies, and where you can go to get additional information and help on doing a safety analysis. Talks a little bit about GIS-based network planning, what it can do, how you can use it. An area where there's quite a bit of information is the bicycle travel demand analysis, why do it, types of demand analysis, which ones are more effective, level of effort, what kinds of data do you need, and it's laid out very nicely in the guide. Cost-benefit analysis talks a little bit about how you use it and then different approaches. So for example, one approach might be to look at the cost of a bike facility and what it can do versus, say, a motor vehicle facility and what it can do. So it gives you some tools there, again, to start doing those comparisons. And then finally, some real good information on just the role of public input. One of the things that we find is there's a direct relationship between sort of the quality of public input, their ownership, the ability to get bike facilities on the ground. So some good guidance there. Chapter 3, bicycle operation and safety. This is a new chapter, and it's really important because it really sets the stage for the design in the subsequent chapters. And a couple things that I think are important worth noting in this chapter. One is that it provides information on the design vehicle. And you see the image on the right of your screen there. That's, of course, the typical design vehicle for a bicycle, but it also looks at characteristics of other types of bicycles that might be on the street or on the trail system. It also gives an overview of traffic principles for bicycles, reiterates the very important point that bicycles are vehicles, and then talks about positioning on the roadway in different situations, importance of following the rules of the road, those kinds of things. And then finally, the causes of bike crashes. And it doesn't go into a lot of detail, but it has some good discussion about the different patterns of urban versus rural. For example, urban, more intersection-based, rural might be some long stretches of narrow two-lane roadways. It talks about different ages and the different patterns we see on adult, young versus adult riders. And then there's some additional information. But again, it gives you a starting place to look at crashes so that when you look at crashes in your own community, it gives you a sense of where you may be in comparison to some sort of national guidelines in that area. Okay, moving on to Chapter 4. This one's a huge chapter. This is the most expanded section in the AASHTO guide. It moved from, I think the first one just had 17 pages. This one has about 70 pages, just to give you a sense of how much this area has been expanded in terms of the on-street facilities. Jennifer already went over a few of the items that we think are the really germane and important changes. Just touch base here on a few other additional items. We already talked about buffered bike lanes, green bike lanes, nuance and width, dooring, a couple other things here. Climbing lanes. What's the relationship between, if you don't have room for bike lanes on both sides of the street, combining a climbing lane with a shared use lane, sort of how you do that. Also some direction on complex intersections. Again, we know that a lot of crashes occur at intersections, so there's a lot of good guidance on bike lanes at intersections, the geometric design of intersections, signalization, and those kinds of things. A lot of good guidance there. As Jennifer mentioned, there's also guidance here on sort of how you achieve this. And again, guidance on lane diets and road diets when it's appropriate, some basic numbers for road diets in terms of when it's easy to do, when you need more study, that kind of guidance. Again, same with Chapter 4, design of on-street facilities. There's several new sections, and we alluded to this earlier, but the chapter where they occurred.
Peter, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're having some trouble hearing you. Your volume's going up and down.
Okay.
Can you try and just speak a little louder, please?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
Let me know if you have a problem again. New sections in terms of Chapter 4, the design of on-street facilities. Shared lane markings. And this reflects the 2009 MUTCD. It talks about where to place, the placement, where a cyclist should be riding in relationship to the markings. As Jennifer mentioned, there's new guidance on bicycle boulevards, when and where to use, and then some of the treatments that you can use to establish bike boulevards. And then finally, wayfinding signage. And again, you're going to be familiar with most of this because a lot of it already is in the 2009 MUTCD, and it's right reflected here, and they complement each other. Okay, Chapter 4 still on the design of on-street facilities. A lot of new guidance on traffic signals, as Jennifer mentioned. Clearance intervals, minimum green time. There's 4 different formulas and charts that allow you to calculate those times. We already mentioned the new bicycle signal and different signal types, and then also the technical guidance on bike detection. And again, this is all found in Chapter 4. Continuing again in Chapter 4, the design of on-street facilities. There's new and revised guidance on paved shoulders, and I think it's some really needed, good design guidance here. Some guidance on rumble strips and the relationship between where you place the rumble strip and the width of the shoulder that's needed if you do use rumble strips. And so I think some really needed guidance there. Expanded guidance on roadway bridges. And again, really reinforcing the concept that bikes need to be accommodated on bridges, but also the kind of accommodation, and then the relationship between the kind of facility you have on the bridge and the approaches to the bridge. And some real good language there, and I think good guidance. Bicycles and traffic calming, that's covered somewhat in the discussion of bicycle boulevards, and there's some expanded guidance on that. Bicycles on freeways. In a lot of states, especially western states, of course, there's places where bikes are allowed on freeways, so there's some good discussion here on when they should be allowed on freeways, where, and then probably really universally applicable everywhere is where you have the access ramps, the on and off. Cyclists need to get either under or over freeways, and some guidance there on how you design those intersections, and because those can be places of high crash areas in some communities, just transitioning between sort of the freeway mentality and then the local road. So if you got a crash issue and you want to focus on something, I think there's some really good guidance here. And then finally, again, bicycles at roundabouts. It talks about 2-lane roundabouts, 4-lane roundabouts, the relationship between when the bike lane should end, when you want to stay in the roundabout, when maybe you want to get out of the roundabout, issues related to handling shared lane markings. Once the bike lane ends as you approach the roundabout, also guidance on the width of the sidewalk. If you take the bike out of the roundabout, or you always have a choice, but that option when there's like a 4-lane roundabout, some of the pros and cons. So really good guidance there. Okay, on the design of shared use paths, we're moving on to Chapter 5. This is now a standalone chapter, and the basis of the chapter is partly practitioner experience, but also there's been some significant studies that contributed to sort of the guidance of this chapter. I think it's really important to remember that when you're talking about shared use paths, you're talking about bicyclists, but you're also talking about pedestrians who use the paths. So when you get into crossing treatment and that kind of thing, it's also important to look at, like number 3 listed here, the safety effects of marked versus unmarked crosswalks at uncontrolled locations, because anytime you have a shared use path, at some point you're going to be crossing the street, either at an intersection or mid-block. And so a lot of the safety research that's been done, maybe more focused on pedestrians, but has also been incorporated and brought into this particular guide. A lot on the accessibility requirements of shared use paths. I'm not going to get into the details. Jennifer already mentioned that we should be looking to the U.S. Access Board website for continued guidance as it emerges. But just a note here, it differentiates between paths that serve as sidewalks and those that are in independent corridors, and some of that nuance. Also, a lot of nuanced guidance on the width of pathways. It gives you guidance on where to go to look at capacity of width and to determine when maybe you need a 11-foot width or a 12-foot or 13-foot. So it really gives you some good guidance on figuring out what's the appropriate width for a particular situation. A lot of really good guidance too on our rails, safety rail guidelines, looking at the relationship between the edge of a pathway. Do you have the 5 feet and sort of on the edge, and then at what point do you need to put in a railing, and then the relationship between the slope to the drop on the edge. And so you really can get a good sense of when you need a railing, where you don't need a railing, and then also guidance on the design of that railing. So some really good stuff in there. Continuing in Chapter 5, the design of shared use paths. Looking at the next slide here is that there's revised design guidance on speed. Again, no single design speed for paths, but it gives you some numbers in terms of how to bring good engineering judgment to this discussion. So it talks about when, for example, maybe 18 miles an hour is generally okay, when you need to go to the 30-mile-an-hour design speed to go down a hill, but it really gives you the guidance to make good decisions. It also gives revised guidance on the horizontal alignment. There's 3 different tables, for example, that you can go to if you're designing a trail that will help you determine what the appropriate curb radii is. It also gives you guidance on when maybe you want to widen out the trail a little bit to accommodate a particular turn, those kinds of things. And the formula now is based on the lean angle rather than super elevation. So again, for when you go into that design level of a trail, it really gives you some good guidance. And then new guidance on speed control and paths. And sort of relates to the bollard issue. Communities in the past have used things like bollards to manage speed. Strongly discouraged, not what you want to do, but it talks about how you can use some of the more subtle kinds of approaches in terms of the geometrics of a path to control the speed. And so, again, some really good guidance. Again, continuing on Chapter 5, anticipating some of the things that are going to be in here. There's revised guidance on grades and also options to mitigate excessive grades. So it talks about the 5%. Then it also relates to, talks about, how do you meet ADA, refers you again to the access board website. And then it talks about some of the kinds of mitigation that are available, like signs and widening and those kinds of things. Also new guidance on stopping sight distance, looking at a whole new braking friction factor. A little bit longer stopping distances now are recommended than before. There's a variety of tables available that look at the relationship of speed and grade, and it gives you some guidance there on that. And then not mentioned here, but also in the guide is a table on vertical crest and the relationship of length to stopping distance. So again, things that you'll want to do if you're doing the actual detailed trail design. Again, on Chapter 5, the design of shared use paths, upgraded guidance on bridges and underpasses. And this is a little bit of some planning advice of when one might be appropriate to the other, some of the advantages and disadvantages, and then also some design guidance if you do it. A section on lighting. It talks about lighting shared use paths, when and where, ideas for the height of the lighting, high enough so it doesn't get vandalized, but not so high it doesn't really work for the trail. Talks about lighting intersections, personal security issues. Again, some very, very good guidance here. Path roadway intersection. This area is really expanded, and a lot of new guidance, especially on mid-block crossings, and detailed guidance there on traffic control. Also, assignment on right-of-way, discussion on stop versus yield signs, a recommendation to move toward yield versus stop. But again, these detailed design guidance here is based on the study that I mentioned earlier on marked versus unmarked crosswalks. Again, you're going to have pedestrians at these crossings, so it's real important to get those correct. Some discussion on crossing islands, medians, and then, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, there's a lot of new guidance on side paths, and of course, side paths at intersections are something that we want to give careful consideration to. And so there's additional guidance here on side paths where you come to an intersection and getting across that intersection. And then just the last couple of slides here, and then we'll turn it back. Chapter 6, bicycle parking facilities. We're not going to do a separate webinar on this. There's a lot of good guidance out there, but just to know that it's here. talks about planning for bike parking, covers short-term bicycle parking, things like location, design, types of racks, and then long-term bicycle parking. And again, some good guidance here, and then it refers you to other guidance. And then finally, last but not at all least, there's additional guidance on maintenance and operations. And I'm not going to read this list to you, but you can see some of the topics that are covered. And the main I guess, message here that talks about how to institutionalize maintenance into sort of annual programs and operations. So, for example, if you have a sweeping program in your community, the idea is to institutionalize it into that sweeping program. Perhaps bike lanes get swept a few more times than they normally would because there's a bike lane there. That kind of thing, building it into your annual routine of how you do maintenance. Same could be applicable, for example, paint. And you see the picture here of some paint going down on a shared use path. So with that, James, I'm going to turn it back over to you, I guess.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter and Jennifer. We will now we have some time for some questions. If you haven't already asked your question, please do so. And if we run out of time for your question, I'm sorry. We'll try to get back to you after the program if possible. But the first question I got, and I can actually answer this one, is what is the price of the guide? And the guide costs $120 for members and $144 for non-members before the discount. And you will receive instructions for how to get that 20% discount in the follow-up email from this webinar. So my first question is, how does this guidance compare to other guidances like Complete Streets, and are there any conflicts?
Well, so I'll answer that. There are lots of different Complete Streets manuals, so I don't know if there's, I'm not aware of any conflicts, but there are a lot of them out there. So most of the time, those manuals don't go into the same level of detail as the AASHTO Bike Guide does on specific design topics. I mean, since this is just a guide about bikeway design, it has the luxury of going into lots of detail, technical detail on lots of different topics, whereas Complete Streets manuals have to cover much broader than just bike facility design. They have to cover pedestrian design. They have to cover some aspects of motor vehicle design as well, and design for transit access. And so they generally don't go into quite as much detail as a guide like this that is just focused on bikeway design.
Okay. Are all the designs in the AASHTO guide accepted by the Federal Highway Administration, and therefore local officials could use federal funding to provide or support those ideas or facilities?
Well, the answer to that is there's nothing in the new AASHTO Bike Guide that conflicts with the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices or the AASHTO Green Book. So yes, these are designs that are accepted by Federal Highway Administration, and you should be able to use them with no problem.
Okay. Do you know if bike boxes and signal heads will be an amendment to the guide once FHWA has more information on them?
That's a good question. I can't speak for AASHTO here. I don't know if they issue amendments to their manuals. I have not seen that in the past, but I suppose it's always possible. If Federal Highways decides to issue interim approval for bike boxes or bike signals, then they're not disallowed by the bike guide. The bike guide doesn't say you can't do them. So I would assume that if Federal Highways issues approval, that you should be able to use them even though they're not covered in the AASHTO Bike Guide.
Okay. Does the guide address designs that meet the needs of hand cyclists who can't dismount, or power-assisted bicycles or e-bikes?
So Peter talked about the study that much of the guide is, a lot of the technical aspects of the guide are based on its characteristics of emerging road and trail users. And that was a Federal Highway Administration funded study that looked at the characteristics of lots of different types of bicyclists, not just, the standard person on a two-wheel bike. It looked at recumbent, hand cyclists, three-wheel bikes, bikes with trailers, just a very wide variety of bicyclists. And so all of the technical guidance in the guide is based on those characteristics. So yes, and the fact that study was used to develop all those technical aspects of the guide. And then the second part of the question, I'm sorry.
We were also curious about power-assisted bicycles or e-bikes, and whether they're appropriate for different types of bike lanes or paths.
Well, so that's a pretty complex question. And not all jurisdictions allow electric bikes on pathways. They have rules against motorized users on pathways. So the first thing to do is to find out if your jurisdiction even allows them to be on it. The bike guide is not, electric bikes were not part of that study that I talked about earlier, the characteristics of emerging trail and roadway users. So the answer is no. The bike guide is, I would assume that the design speeds for those vehicles would be higher, and so some aspects of trail design especially would not meet the needs of those users.
One of the questions I've gotten, or I've gotten versions of the same question, is it possible to read chapters of the bike guide online without purchasing the whole thing, or must one purchase the whole guide to be able to access any of it? And is it available electronically, or is it available only in print?
The guide is available electronically from the AASHTO bookstore. So you can purchase a PDF, a download that you can put on your own computer of the guide. It's the same cost as purchasing a hard copy of the guide. I don't believe you can purchase a single chapter of the guide and not purchase the whole thing, however.
Okay, and I'm assuming if you purchased the electronic version, you could print it out if you wanted, right?
Yes, yes, you can.
Okay. How often is the guide updated?
Well, this guide was updated. The last version of the guide was 1999, so 13 years later. I think the goal is to update the guide more often than that span of time. But I think it depends a lot on that NCHRP process that I talked about at the beginning of the webinar. That's a lengthy process, and so like I said, I think the goal is to get it done faster, but I couldn't speculate on how fast that is.
Okay. Do you know, as innovations from other resources like NACTO are deployed and researched, are there any procedures in place for AASHTO to evaluate and endorse these solutions?
If those solutions are signs, signals, and pavement markings, then the procedure for evaluating those is really lies with the Federal Highway Administration. And so there's an experimentation process that's detailed in the METCD for how to do an experiment. Federal Highways evaluates those and approves those, and then as Federal Highways adopts new sign signals and pavement markings, then AASHTO and AASHTO's guidance will then include those things in their guidance and often elaborate on how to use those devices. And so a good example in the guide is shared lane marking. In the 2009 version of the MUTCD, shared lane markings were included. Pretty, not a lot of guidance on shared lane markings, just some basic guidance. The AASHTO Bike Guide has a great deal more on shared lane markings and different configurations of roadways and the fact that you can use a shared lane marking in the middle of a lane if that's the right place for a bicyclist to ride. And so that's an example of how it enters into AASHTO publications from the MUTCD.
Okay. Another question about the discount. Apparently a couple of our attendees have already purchased the bike guide. Do you know if they might be able to get a refund for their discount from AASHTO at this point?
Oh my goodness, that's a good question. I have no idea. They could. I'm sure they could try, but I just wouldn't know how to answer that. They should contact AASHTO and ask that question.
Oh, okay. Does the guide discuss user compliance? For example, having cyclists stop at stop signs is a problem in some areas. Does the guide discuss how to get users of bike lanes and bike paths to comply with the rules and laws of the road, or offer any suggestions how to improve that?
Well, that's a great question. I'll answer, and Pete, if you have anything you want to add to it. Mm-hmm. The section on bicycle operations and safety, Chapter 3, talks about sort of some basic dynamics of bike travel, and the fact that bicyclists, they use their own muscle power to start and stop, and so they're much more reluctant to slow down and stop, especially in environments where there's really no traffic. If it's a neighborhood environment where there's a stop sign and there's nothing there, there's no approaching cars. And so it talks about some of those basic dynamics of bike travel. And then there's a section on traffic calming and making traffic calming compatible with bicyclists. I believe that's in the on-road chapter that talks about sort of bike-friendly traffic calming. And stop signs are sometimes used as traffic calming, and this is one of the reasons why that's not a terribly good solution for traffic calming on bikeways. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. One of the principles that's really found throughout the entire guide is good engineering invites right use. And what it's suggesting, and this gets back to what we've talked about a little bit, is how it's just sort of the practical approach this took, is that it looks at what's common practice, what's common behavior, and how do we design in a way that it's just you're automatically going to get the right kind of behavior. So you really start to minimize situations where 90% of the people kind of do the wrong thing. There's probably a design issue. So you'll find that theme throughout of it, and just sort of adding to what Jennifer said. So for example, when there's the discussion on a shared use path, whether you use a yield sign or a stop sign, I recommend if you are going to have traffic control, you go to the yield sign, because that's the common practice. In many, many places it just makes sense, especially on a low-volume, two-lane road, slow up, yield if appropriate. You don't need to stop, and you continue on. So it starts from there, but it doesn't give you. It's not an education manual. It doesn't give real specifics on how to do education programs, for example. There's other places you would need to go for that.
One of the questions I also got was, why does the guide not address raised bike lanes?
Good question. So raised bike lanes, at the time that the research was being done for the bike guide, raised bike lanes were not a widely used bikeway type. They were still something that communities were experimenting with, and the panel for the bike guide and the consulting team felt that it was an area that still needed more study before it was appropriate to include it in a national guideline. Just for those of you that don't know what raised bike lanes are, they're typically a bike lane that's at a level between the sidewalk or curb level and the roadway level, so at a middle place between those two levels. And there are some communities that have implemented those as bike facilities. So I guess the answer is people felt like the jury was still out, and it just hadn't entered into standard practice yet as a facility type, and thus there was some reluctance to include it in the guide.
Okay. Will one of the future webinars cover Chapter 3, and if so, which one?
No. This is Pete. It'll be touched on, but not specifically addressed.
Okay. Has there been any new research on mitigating driveway conflicts, and is that included in the guide?
I can start with that.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a number of things about driveways. It talks from a planning point of view. It talks about limiting the number of driveways, a little bit about access management. It also talks about the design of driveways, i.e. driveways should look like driveways and not streets, so that, for example, if you have a side path, that it's real clear who has the right-of-way. And then it talks about some of the safety maintenance things with driveways. So, for example, if you have a gravel driveway coming to a paved path and a paved road, you want to pave the apron back into the driveway so the gravel doesn't spill onto the driveway. So you'll find references throughout the guide that refer to driveways.
Yeah, and there was some new research on driveway conflicts at driveways and intersections that had been done by the Florida Department of Transportation that was incorporated into the guidance that you see in the 2012 bike guide.
Okay. Does the guide deal with some lighting issues both for nighttime and daytime lighting? And with daytime specifically, does it address under bridge lighting where a driver or bicyclist might be coming from a bright area suddenly into a shadow area, as well as nighttime lighting?
I can start with that one. And I think I alluded to this a little bit. It talks about the importance of lighting at intersections. Talks about lighting of trails. Talks about the height of the lighting. It also discusses some of the neighborhood challenges sometimes of lighting trails at night, and maybe options for having lighting during certain hours, but not other hours if the trail is not open. It also talks about security issues related to lighting, and it specifically mentions underpasses, things like that. In terms of going from light areas to dark areas and the position of lighting, not a lot of detail there, but there's other federal studies and guidance that's out on lighting that you can go to for that more detailed guidance on that.
Yeah, there's a whole section on lighting in Chapter 5, Section 5.2.12, and it covers all kinds of things from, what type of light poles, what heights of light poles are more appropriate for pathways, And it talks about lighting in pathway tunnels and underpasses, and you know, how to calculate those, you know, what type of lighting that you would need in those locations, and especially as well for long tunnels where lighting at entrances might be different from what you do in the middle of that tunnel.
Does the guide address pedestrian warning devices such as bells or horns on bicycles? And do municipalities frequently require such warning devices?
Ah, that's a good question. No, I don't believe the guide talks about warning devices on bicycles, and I think it goes back to what Peter said. It's not really an educational manual. It's not, doesn't talk about etiquette between users really. And I don't know, Pete, do you know of any jurisdictions that require bells?
Yeah, a lot of jurisdictions do. They require, and even in state laws, usually gives you an option. It'll say, you know, when you pass a pedestrian, for example, the law might be use bell or voice when passing, something along those lines. So usually not. There are some places that do, but usually gives you sort of that option.
Okay. Does the guide discuss various designs to accommodate temporary trail endings?
The chapter on maintenance and operations is where to look for that kind of guidance. And I'm just looking at it through it right now to see. You know, operating bikeways and work zones is a section in that section 7.3, and so it talks about temporary traffic controls for bikeways.
There's also under the bike lane, where the bike lanes are discussed. There's guidance on, for example, when you use the sign, you know, bikeway ends or bike lane, I should say bike lane ends, and then when you need it, when you don't, and transitioning between different facility types. For example, you probably don't need to use the bike lane end signs if you're transitioning to a shared lane marking situation. In other words, there's an ongoing facility, so it just gives you a little more nuanced guidance on when you have to use those end signs.
Okay. The chapter that includes guidance on signal practices, does that include anything about designing a signal timing scheme specifically to promote bicycle progression?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And it's based on you know, the design speeds that came out of that, characteristics of emerging trail users, trail and roadway users. So there's a great deal of guidance on that, on those topics in that section of the guide.
And what's nice about it is that it even looks at some of the nuances of, are you a moving cyclist or are you stopped and then crossing? You know, one of the problems cyclists have is if they're on a side street, there's a signal, they're trying to cross a really wide, busy arterial. You have to start up, you have to have clearance, you've got to get through. And so all sorts of guidance on sort of not only green time, but yellow time and red time, all-way red time, and it's all there in the different formulas. So yeah, it's a real good guidance. Yeah,
there's 7 or 8 pages of guidance on signal design. So.
Okay. Do you know if it's possible for a community to receive federal funding for constructing bicycle facilities that are not 100% AASHTO compliant?
I started.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, because you know, I think one of the earlier slides that Jennifer showed was how is the guide used, and so most states, we talked about local communities too, use either adopt the AASHTO guide the way it is, or they develop their own version, and quite often they may take a guide. What is a guide? They may make it a standard in their state or local community. There's a lot of places in the guide where there's some room for engineering judgment and some flexibility. Sometimes local communities lock it in a little tighter. And so sort of to answer the question is can you use federal funds? And usually the way it works is that if you're using federal funds, you're going to need to follow the state guidelines or standards if they've made them that, or the local ones. So I mentioned like if a local community develops guidelines based off of the AASHTO guide. If there's federal funds involved, they would probably look at both their local guidelines, but then they would also need to look to their state guidelines to see if it's appropriate. So if the state guideline is slightly different than the AASHTO guideline, but it's still within sort of the boundaries of what's appropriate, yeah, you're going to be able to do that. If they're really outside those boundaries, then you could have an issue.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a good example are if you wanted to put a bike box in a project and it had federal funds involved, then you would, there's a process for getting federal approval for doing that, and it's you know, it's just a standard process, so it's not impossible to get federal highways approval for things. In fact, it's gotten a lot easier in recent years. They've become much more you know, interested in and open to new strategies for accommodating bicyclists, and it really goes along with how quickly our profession is evolving. It's so many new techniques and new designs. So it's possible.
Just add one more thing to that and just on the thinking that it's a lot easier and possible. On certain, without getting into all the details, on certain kinds of experimental activities, if there's been FHWA guidance given on it, but it's not in the AASHTO guide, and you're going for experimental status, you sometimes have the choice of doing it for one facility, but you could also do it for like a whole jurisdiction of a transportation agency. So again, in some cases, it can be a one-time event for multiple locations.
Does the guide address issues such as right turn on red and automatic pedestrian phase at signals?
It does. Not in a lot of detail, but if you look at the discussion again of the SIDEPATHS, and it talks about, you know, it gives you a whole bunch of different options for mitigating, you know, challenging turn issues at signals. It does talk about limiting right turn on red in those situations.
Does the guide get into guidance about path priority over driveways and minor streets?
Yeah, there's a section there again on the assignment of right-of-way, and it's not going to tell you, you know, bikes should have priority here or motor vehicles here, but what it does do is it gives you some very good a template's too strong a word, but it gives you some guidelines for making that decision. So again, it comes down to good engineering judgment, making a good call, but it gives you a list of things that you should consider and look at.
Yeah, and another thing that's significant about the guide acknowledges that there are some locations where the amount of people using the pathway is higher than the amount of people that are crossing are on the street that the pathway crosses. And so the guide allows for to place a stop sign on the street and have motor vehicle traffic stop for the path rather than vice versa.
Following up on one of our questions from earlier, does the guide consider construction detours or other temporary traffic controls?
Yes. There's a section. It's the last chapter, maintenance and safety, maintenance and operations. And there's a section on operating bikeways and work zones.
Okay. I've got two questions about railroad crossings, or just railroads in general. Does the guide offer any suggestions or recommendations on how to deal with rail crossings? And is there any information for trails next to rails, such as fencing or distance between them?
The first question, it provides some very good detailed guidance on how to cross railroad tracks, and it looks at, for example, it has diagrams in the guide where it shows a bike lane approaching a railroad track at a skewed intersection, and then what you need to do to design it so that the bicyclist can cross the tracks at close to a 90-degree angle. So there's very good guidance in there. I don't know, Jennifer, I don't think there's any guidance on rails with trails. Maybe.
No, I think that there's just an acknowledgement that sometimes pathways are built adjacent to active railroads, but the Federal Highway Administration issued some guidance on rails with trails a few years ago that is fairly detailed. It was a joint study between the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Railroad Administration. It has a chapter on design of rails with trails.
All right.
Maybe I just add to this by inference. It doesn't get into the issue whether it's obviously a good or bad idea, but it does talk about shared use paths and setbacks from fences, setbacks from slopes, setbacks from walls and any other barriers. So you could get, in terms of just the design part of it, you could extrapolate a lot of good information in terms of doing a rail with trail.
I'm going to try and squeeze in two more questions, and then we'll have to conclude. The first one is, does the guide recommend that if a low traffic area, that bikes be able to yield instead of stop at an intersection?
I'm assuming the question means that a place where a bike path is crossing a roadway. And yes, it allows you to use a yield sign, in fact encourages using a yield sign instead of a stop sign, because actual behavior shows that in many cases, I've been on many paths that exist today where drivers regularly stop, even though the bike facility is the facility that has the stop sign. Drivers are yielding to bicyclists. So the guide just acknowledges behaviors that already typically happen on pathways, and it allows yield signs. It allows you to place a stop sign, as I said, on the road instead of on the path as well.
And the last question is, do you know why the guide isn't in color?
No, I don't. I don't know the answer to that. I would guess it's quite a bit longer than the last version, and it was probably just prohibitively expensive to make it in color. So I suppose we should all be grateful, because it would have cost a lot more if it were in color.
Okay, well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for discussion today. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question. I believe many of the specific questions we received will be answered in the upcoming webinars that will delve a little more deeply into the specifics of the guide. Today's webinar was a little more of an overview. Once again, a recording of this webinar will be available sometime next week, probably, on our website, www.walkinginfo.org/webinars, as well as a PDF copy of the presentation will be available. That should be up, I hope, later today. I've gotten some notes that there's been some issues with the link to the discount PDF. I'll take a look at that later today and hopefully have it fixed. But please feel free to send me an email if you're having issues with it, james@hsrc.unc.edu. Again, that's james@hsrc.unc.edu, and I will try to send you the PDF directly. As a reminder, we will be conducting 6 more webinars on the bike guide over the coming months, delving more deeply into specifics of the new guide. And I want to finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar is ended. Again, we very much appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. I want to thank our presenters again, Jennifer Toole and Peter Lagerway. We greatly appreciate you coming out today and helping us and giving us this overview. And thank you all for attending today's PBIC AASHTO Bike Guide webinar series.